Good afternoon, class. Today we are going to review Chapter 15, the Juvenile Justice System. So this is a very good chapter, has a lot of good information, a lot of details, and again, we're looking at terminology for you to understand and remember, not necessarily dates or other details, but just mostly broad overview of the juvenile justice system. And what we're going to be doing while we review this is we're going to be going over how different and similar the adult system is to the juvenile system. So there's going to be a lot of terminology that is different from the adult system, but it means the same thing with juveniles. Okay, so here we go. First of all, the juvenile system is changing. It's gone from throwing away the key, locking kids up, to research has shown that children's brains are not developed and therefore they can change. So the emphasis is now on rehabilitation. And many juveniles who are involved in the criminal justice system as a minor do grow out of that. So this chapter kind of talks about the disproportionality of youth who are involved in certain offenses and again can grow out of that due to their maturing nature. So desistance means stopping criminal activity. So most youths who commit felonies, serious crimes, greatly reduce their offending over time. So it becomes less and less statistically. They've also done studies about juveniles that spend time in juvenile hall or juvenile facilities does not reduce their recidivism, but community-based aftercare programs are very effective, and substance abuse treatment also helps reduce substance abuse as well as criminal offending. So again, juveniles are more or less looking at a lot of rehabilitation at a younger age rather than an adult that's 25 or 28 or 40 who commits a crime. They have much less rehabilitation aspects. So that's some of the differences between youth and adults. So the juvenile justice system only involves those that are under 18 years old, and it supervises, investigates, cares for, confines youthful offenders, and it is subject to the juvenile court system, completely different from the adult court. And again, like we said, the system has roots in the adult system but is more uniform, and the clear agreement about the purpose of the juvenile system is rehabilitation. It's not about locking somebody up, as we're going to see in a few minutes. So the book does a good job talking about the history of juvenile justice, and basically back in the medieval days there was no difference. Children were thrown into jails with adults. There was no separate courts, so everything was the same. But as time went on, as we're going to see in a few minutes, the court system in the United States changed for the better because minors were recognized as those who could be rehabilitated and should not be lumped in with adult offenders. So the term delinquency, per the book, means juvenile actions or conduct in violation of criminal law, juvenile status offenses, or other juvenile misbehavior. So that's the definition of delinquency, per the book. The earliest philosophy that we know is called parens patriae, and that means that the king had rights over a child. That was the original philosophy. So in the villages and the towns and the kingdoms back in the medieval days, literally the king had complete responsibility of that child and what to do with that child. So if there was a child that was misbehaving, stealing, killing animals, setting things on fire, the king had the ultimate responsibility to do something with that child. The Enlightenment era led to increased concern, though, for the child's well-being, because children obviously were being abused because they were not protected during these times. We'll talk about this Enlightenment period here. Excuse me, during the 19th century, many immigrants led to large numbers of children living on the streets when immigrants came into New York usually, and it led to the development of the House of Refuge, and the book talks about that. Also, the Child Savers movement came into being during this time, and again, it was to help juveniles that were delinquent and have them go to a different school so they again could be rehabilitated to then join society. So these two 19th century rehabilitation efforts were very well known and very popular. The first juvenile court was established in Illinois in 1899, which is a long time ago, but then again, not that long time ago. This is the first time a separate juvenile system was functioning differently from adult court system. And the term delinquent was used instead of criminal at that time. So again, this is the start of the change of the systems of adult and juvenile. From that moment on, when that court was established, the focus was on the betterment of the child, not punishment. And reformation over retribution was looked at. Reforming somebody rather than having them pay back their debts. Juvenile Court Act was established in 1938 for the federal system. Very interesting to read about in their book. So the principles of the juvenile court movement, instead of the king being the ultimate parent, it's now the state. So the government is the ultimate parent of the child. Children are worth saving with non-punitive procedures, meaning you can divert them out of the system. Children should be nurtured and protected from being stigmatized. And again, a stigma is, when a child continues to do things that they're not supposed to, like, I don't know, myself, growing up as a teenager, and I would always be told by my mom that if I continued to act like a juvenile delinquent, then I'm going to become one. So that was kind of my stigma that I had, that if I don't change my ways, I'm going to become a juvenile delinquent, which I kind of did. But it all worked out. Finally, that non-criminal procedures are necessary in order to help the child. So again, not locking them up necessarily, but getting them rehabilitation help. And this all is predicated on the younger the person is, the more likely they're going to be rehabilitated. Some terminology for you that you need to know, that children in the juvenile justice system, and again, some of you, when you graduate, will be working with children in juvenile hall or camps or rehabilitation efforts. So these are some of the terms that you'll be using. So a delinquent child is a child who violates the criminal law. An undisciplined child is a child who's beyond parental control and refuses to obey legitimate authority, i.e. parents, police, etc. That's undisciplined. And a dependent child is a child who has no parents or guardians to care for him or her. And they're usually dependent on the state or the county as far as going into placement. Some more terms. There's a neglected child. There's a child who does not receive proper care from parents or guardians. An abused child. That's a child who suffers physical, emotional, or sexual abuse from a parent or guardian. And then finally, a status offender. That's a child who violates laws written only for children, like curfew or drinking alcohol. Those would be status offenses. So the legal environment of the juvenile justice system has allowed a hands-off approach. Okay? Today, though, juveniles are guaranteed many of the same procedural rights as adults, and we'll talk about some of those differences. These are some of the court cases which you should read about and know. They're very important. Yes, these are the cases you need to read about. There's others, but these are the ones that are important for us. Some legal right issues. So most states have extended Miranda provisions to juveniles, but sometimes it's unclear if they can legally waive their Miranda rights because they're under 18. And when you're under 18, you can't sign contracts, you're not an adult, you can't do anything without your parents' permission. So it's kind of cloudy on if you can Mirandize a minor who's 14 about a crime, question them, and they admit the crime and have that be used as evidence because they can't really legally do anything under 18. So there's always issues when somebody's given their Miranda rights if they are a juvenile. So it's kind of touch and go. We don't really know the way the court's going to administer the Miranda rights. The area of juvenile rights, as far as investigative procedures, in 1985 there was a case where school children have reasonable expectation of privacy in their personal property, because apparently there was a search of some lockers, because back then they had lockers, and desks, and it was a rule that they have a expectation of privacy within their school, so these could not be searched. So another case must consider the child's age when determining whether suspects would feel free not to respond to police questioning. So again, anytime there's a minor involved, there's a lot of questionable things about whether they can talk to police, if their parents have to be present, if they sign a waiver. So all you law enforcement officers out there, you need to pay attention in your constitutional law class when it comes to children and the law. The process today is basically, it all begins with their age. So most states, including California, it's anyone under 18. And the juvenile court has exclusive jurisdiction to deal with juveniles. The only time the juvenile court would not deal with juveniles is if the district attorney has determined that the child has committed an adult crime, like murder or rape or arson or something that is so heinous that it should go to the adult system. And that happens frequently. In certain states, you have to be a certain age. You can't be under 16 and be charged with the death penalty in most states. But if you're 17 and you commit a murder, you're probably going to go to adult court and not a juvenile court. So comparing the systems, juveniles do not have all the due process rights that adults do. They are entitled to some due process protections. Talk about that in a minute. Other differences, that there's not so much emphasis on the legal issues of guilt or innocence. It's more about treatment. We want to treat the minor and get them better so they don't commit more crimes. We don't want to punish them necessarily. There is privacy. In the juvenile system, the courts are closed. No one can be in there. Only person that can be in there is the DA, the defense attorney, the judge, and the minor's parents or guardians. So it's a closed court, unlike other courts which are open to the public. There's no cameras in the juvenile courts. There's no people filming it. So it's private. The disposition or the verdicts, the sentencing, are based on social science about what is best for the child. Usually there's no long-term confinement. Juveniles are always in separate facilities from adults, and the judge has complete broad discretionary decisions on what to do with that child. So a lot of differences so far. The system works is pretty basic, and the book does a good job talking about it. We'll talk about it briefly. It's a 4-stage process. There's the intake part, there's adjudication, disposition, and finally the post-adjudicatory review. And again, we're going to look at this and compare the adult system to the juvenile system so you understand and know and can talk about these issues. Intake and detention. So basically intake means the booking process. Okay, so when a minor is taken to intake at juvenile hall, usually that's because there's been a complaint and there's been a minor's been placed into custody. They're not arrested because a juvenile can't be arrested. They're only placed into custody, and the juvenile petition, or basically the criminal complaint as an adult, is filed by schools, neighbors, store managers, parents, etc., because of some issues that the minor is involved in. It can be criminal, can be a status offense. But the intake, again, is going to juvenile hall and being booked into the system. Okay, we don't use the term booked because that's an adult term. We use the term intake. Most times, once a juvenile is booked at intake, they are released and try to be diverted from the system at that time. Some may still spend some time in custody before their adjudication. Once the detention hearing occurs, this is a requirement that the judge or the referee in a juvenile court determines if the juvenile requires secure detention until they're adjudicated. So usually within 24 hours of their placement into custody, they go before a juvenile court judge, and the judge says, we do not need to hold this person. We're just going to write them a summons and they can return. So most times juveniles are diverted out of the system immediately, and or they do not have to stay within custody because they're not a danger. Okay, we talked about that. Intake officers have considerable discretion. Some of you will end up being intake officers. And at that time, the intake officer, juvenile hall, can determine if they need to be detained, if they can be diverted, or if the dismissal of charges can occur. And again, this is where you look at what is in the betterment of the minor. We don't want to punish, we want to rehabilitate. The preliminary hearing is determined if probable cause to believe the juvenile committed the alleged act. May be held at the detention hearing. Transfer hearing may be held if the case may be transferred to adult court because they have committed an adult crime. And some cases that different statutes may mandate that transfer. So the adjudicatory hearing, similar to an adult trial, so it's adjudication, but we don't call it a trial, we call it adjudicatory hearing. And again, emphasis is on privacy, so it's a closed court. It's very informal. It's very speedy. It's based on evidence. The court philosophy is about what is the best for the minor, and there's no jury for a minor. In an adjudicatory hearing, it's only a judge. So those are a lot of differences with the court hearing of an adult and a juvenile. There's also programs out there that some high schools have. They have teen court programs. So this is where they have literally a court set up in a high school that will go before, the juvenile will go before a jury and judge of their peers. And a lot of DUIs end up in a teen court program. Some high schools have this around here. It's pretty interesting. The disposition is basically the same as a sentencing hearing for adults, and it is used for the court to decide what they should do to the juvenile, what action to take. So they can confine the minor or have non-confinement as a disposition or sentence. And a disposition is always going to be what's best for the minor, not punishment. Usually the least restrictive alternative that meets the juvenile's needs and protects society will be used, whether it's going to be ankle monitoring, whether it's going to be probation, whether it's going to be community service. Majority of juveniles are placed on probation. The post-adjudicatory review is basically an appeal, which all cases of adults can have, but there's not a lot that's kind of unclear right now about making appeals with juveniles in the juvenile system. So some courts do that, some courts do not, so it's kind of murky right now. The book kind of doesn't really know if they're allowed or not. Okay? So when we talk about secure institutions, these are going to be juvenile halls that are hard-walled, barbed wire that keep kids inside because of their potential harm to the community. depends on a semi-secure facility would be like a boys' ranch or a camp where there's no fences and no walls. And again, other institutions which are not secure are going to be halfway houses, boot camps, forester camps, group homes, private facilities, etc. And again, these are more for the less violent offenders who are in rehabilitation status. There's a lot of custodial programs that are out there. Most facilities are small and very well staffed, intensively staffed, because there's a lot of rehabilitation counseling going on. Much more staff than adult jails. Some trends. The book talks about the models of reform. There's a resolution strategy, there's reinvestment strategies, and realignment strategies. So make sure you read about these. They kind of make sense about what to do with the reform of the juvenile. And that is the chapter for today. So make sure you read this. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put it on the discussion board, or you can email me. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Have a great day.